There's lots of different kinds of punctuation marks, and there's a good reason for using each one of them. But sometimes people don't understand exactly how to use them, and it makes their writing less effective than it should be. So what I want to talk about today is the semicolon. Semicolons create a pause that's stronger than a comma, but not as strong as that of a period, and they're used to show close connections between related ideas. So let's look at some examples of this. There's lots of different ways semicolons can be used, and if you learn to use them effectively, your writing is going to be a lot better. One way semicolons can be used is to link independent clauses. Now remember, an independent clause is something that can stand alone as a sentence. Sometimes people use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Remember, fanboys are the coordinating conjunctions. They use these to join independent clauses. But a semicolon can give a writer a more subtle way of showing the reader that two clauses are closely related. The clause that follows a semicolon sometimes restates an idea that's expressed in the first clause, and sometimes it expands on it or contrasts to the one that was before the semicolon. Let's take a look at the example that's here in red. Immigration acts were passed. Newcomers had to prove, besides moral correctness and financial solvency, their ability to read. Now this is a quote by Mary Gordon. Now if you look, she uses a semicolon to join the two clauses. The first clause is very short. Immigration acts were passed. After the semicolon, she expands on what these immigration laws were. So it's more effective in the way that she's used it because it elaborates on the beginning clause. Sometimes two independent clauses are joined by a coordinated conjunction, and they already have commas in them. Using a semicolon in this case is going to make the sentence easier to read. It won't be so many commas that it's overwhelming to the reader and the meaning is muddied up or made less easy to grasp. So let's look at this quote by William F. Buckley Jr. Every year, whether the Republican or the Democratic Party is in office, more and more power drains away from the individual to feed vast reservoirs in far-off places, and we have less and less say about the shape of events which shape our future. Now, if a comma had been used instead of a semicolon, that would have been a lot of clauses linked together using commas, and it would have made the sentence a lot more difficult to read and understand. Semicolons can also link independent clauses that are joined by conjunctive adverbs or transitions. Now, a semicolon, not a comma, should link independent clauses that are joined by an adverb like however or therefore, or a transition such as a result, or for example. If you use a comma in a sentence like this, you're going to end up with a comma splice. And a comma splice is something that we don't want in our writing. So let's look at two examples here. The circus comes as close to being the world in microcosm as anything I know. In a way, it puts all the rest of show business in the shade. Now, if that semicolon had been a comma instead, what we would have is a comma splice, and the sentence wouldn't work. It would need to be revised. But using a semicolon makes the sentence work perfectly. When you're separating items in a series, you often use a comma. But if those items have other punctuation, a comma is going to make it much more difficult to understand the sentence. So use a semicolon. Now, if you need to refresh your memory about how to use commas to separate items in a series, go back to your writing journal and find My Comma Book. It's a foldable that we made, and it should be inside your writing journal. When these items that are going to be in a series have commas or other kind of punctuation, semicolons can make the sentence so much clearer. So let's look at the example. Anthropology encompasses archaeology, the study of ancient civilizations through artifacts. Linguistics, the study of the structure and development of language, and cultural anthropology, the study of language, customs, and behavior. There's a lot of commas in that sentence, and adding more by trying to use commas to link together those items in a series would have made the sentence virtually impossible to understand. Semicolons are a much better choice in this case. Sometimes people use semicolons wrong, though. You want to use a comma, not a semicolon, to separate an independent clause from a dependent clause or phrase. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. Now, I've put the commas in there, but imagine that the commas were actually semicolons. The police found fingerprints, which they used to identify the thief. With the comma, it's a great sentence. With the semicolon, we would end up with the clause, which they used to identify the thief. That would be a fragment. And fragments are something that we don't want to put in our writing. Look at the other example. The new system would encourage students to register for courses online. Now, if we used a semicolon there instead of a comma, we would have a fragment, thus streamlining registration. That can't stand alone as a sentence, so it needs to be attached using a comma, not a semicolon. Another time that semicolons are often misused is to introduce a series or a list. This is when you need to use a colon, not a semicolon. Look at the example that I've used. The reunion tour includes the following bands. That's where you put the colon to introduce this series or list. Then we have the little names of the bands following the colon. Urban Waste, Murphy's Law, Rapid Deployment, and ISM. So sometimes that's another way people misuse a semicolon. And it's important to know the difference between a colon, a semicolon, and how they're used. The semicolon is a very interesting and important punctuation mark. So I would encourage you to learn how to use it correctly, because it can really add a lot to your writing. I think you'd be surprised how much stronger and more effective your writing is if you can master the use of a semicolon.